rather than review any of the new comics I got, here is Satan's Son, number 7 from the 90s. This one has been coming for a while. I have got a lot to say about it. Not much to say about the cover though. The cover is par for the course with this series. This is the first issue written by, well, the first issue fully written by anyway, Len Kaminski. He comes sandwiched between the worst ones, and he sets off straight away with a multiple act saga called Incarnate. It's not bad, this story. It is the best that this series ever gets. One of the biggest things is that Satan's Son isn't even close to the same level of insufferable, smarmy, smug, cynical arsehole that he is in the rest of the title. He has still got his source, he has still got his edges to him, but it is a fine distinction between knob and knobhead. He definitely is made to feel more of an active protagonist. His overall motivation in this story is largely altruistic. He is doing good. He is doing something because he thinks it is the right thing to do. There is the underhanded play that it will annoy his dad, but Satan's Son isn't saying every 3 panels that he's only doing this to piss off his dad. As I said, the writer of this is Len Kaminski, and that is a name you will be familiar with from all the most bland 90s comics you can remember. I think his big run, the thing he is most known for, is a run on Iron Man, and that was also my first real experience with him. I found his Iron Man stuff to be ridiculously boring. He even puts Roddy Rhodes in the title role for a bit. He makes Roddy Rhodes the title star again, and that should predisposition me to like the run or the writer, but I did not care an inch for anything in his run. Technically, it's not dreadful, but I think being boring is probably worse than being bad. His other works include some very unflattering and uninspiring DC titles. Jared Leto's solo series in the 90s. Some Doctor Strange, which were with, or they were, Roger Thomas plots, I believe. Ghost Driver 2019, which I have never read, even though there is a cover with Doom 2019 on it. He did all those random Fantastic Force fill-ins about Rubik and Girl Beyond a Man, one of which comes in the middle of Simon Waltonson's final story arc on Fantastic Force. Worst of all, Len Kaminski co-created Slapstick. He's written nothing that should really make you feel any semblance of hope that he might be a good writer. There are continuing plot lines and strands from the previous run. We have Peter Gabriel here, the Devil Hunter, as featured in Haunt of Salisbury Hill. I think the inclusion of this guy was pure Kurt Busey. Drag out a forgotten character from the 70s and lord it over everyone that you remembered them. With that said, I don't think it is a bad choice of a character to incorporate into Satan's Son's stories. The shame is that he was incorporated into some of the worst Satan's Son stories. He is, like everything in the title, used its best in this story by Len Kaminski. Our plot is that there are missing souls. There are some people on Earth who are missing their souls. I decided I wouldn't get too into the plot in this one and talk about the writer, and there is a sneaky reason for that. When it comes to part 2, I can cut away to this issue to explain the plot. This can be my routine cutaways for that video. Although I did think discussing the writer was the appropriate way to start this off. I said I didn't like Len Kaminski, and it was my dislike for Len Kaminski came from the combination of not enjoying his work and two things that made me immediately pigeonhole him as the sort of shithead I don't like. First, I have mentioned this several times before. In an issue of Iron Man, he has Iron Man and Captain America sit down and talk about things. And they complain about how things are always grim and gritty now. Everything is dark and mature and violent. Typical Kurt Busey and Martin Quaid style rubbish, where they have to dog on comics to make their own comics look better by their own comparison. The thing that makes Len Kaminski's attempt at it laughably out of touch and embarrassing is the things he cites as dark and violent and grim and gritty are The New Warriors and 90s Thor, which is the most corny Silver Age pastiche Marvel were putting out. That is almost endearingly off-point. What isn't is he wrote a sequel to Marky Mark G's Justice League, and it is offensive. He undermines and obliterates any of the deeper meaning in the original miniseries by making it canonical fact that the Justice League were villains, rather than conflicted or well-intentioned or misguided. No, they were villains who ravaged their world and left it to be feasted upon by vultures. And that is preferable to the Justice League in control. Now, I still think Len Kaminski deserves blame for that one shot, but I have come to understand that two of the usual culprits had a bigger hand in it than written by Len Kaminski would lead you to believe. The story opens with half the characters being written out, dying or sent off on buses. This was actually Kurt Busey. He wanted this to happen. He thought that there were too many characters involved with Marvel's Justice League, and he wanted rid of any that were not direct analogues to founding members of DC's Justice League. Then, the spiteful undoing of any moral complexity of the original story was at the behest of editor Tom Beevort. And I know exactly why he wanted to do this to Marky Mark G's big story. Tom Beevort hated that Marky Mark G had written a 4-page epilogue to the Korvac Dallas story for a reprint in 1991. In that, the Avengers offered up the point that ultimately Korvac Dallas was evil and a fascist. Tom Beevort wouldn't allow those extra 4 pages to be included in reprints for a while because he claimed that it ruined the story. It doesn't, but that is a discussion for another time. At the same time, he was keeping that out of collections of that story. He was getting Len Kaminski to write a follow-up to Marky Mark G's story, where he did the exact same thing and would affix it to all the Justice League collections. For what it's worth, it took about 10 years, but XL's retconned it. And it doesn't undo it, but it does make it so the Justice League characters were wronged and not to blame for what became of their Earth. We are at the second act low point in my summary of Len Kaminski. And so to go with that, here is poor Mrs. Satan's Son, the cat, in all her undignified glory. Even this shite, and Etrigan, I don't like that the cat is now a drooling basket case, and I deplore that a great character like Etrigan is being trashed in this series. But both of them are treated more respectfully by Len Kaminski than anywhere else in this Satan's Son book. Satan's Son is being called in on exorcism duties to look into one of these people who no longer have a soul. And in this case, and in all the cases, it is a bit more complicated than them lacking a soul. This man, he was in a coma, and when he woke up he was someone else. A soul from hell took over the body, while their actual soul is then trapped in hell. It's not something that even these damned souls did themselves. This one, for example, he wants to be returned to hell because he thinks it is where he belongs. You were seeing a play, a gambit by Satan to try and acquire souls that he maybe isn't entitled to by discreetly replacing them with other souls and hoping no one higher up the chain or anyone like Satan's Son or Doctor Strange who could oppose them will notice. I actually really like even the basic story idea here. I think it is a great one to do with this character. Satan's Son gets to fight back against his father's evil, and that is one of the big central ideas with this character. His attempts at atonement and redemption and rebellion against his heritage and inheritance. Satan's Son isn't the only person being redeemed. I am also talking about the redemption of Len Kaminski in this video. And it all began with this, actually. Not this issue, rather an issue of this storyline. Issue 9. It was an otherwise random issue I had of this series. I read this series in full ages ago, and I didn't like it. I came into it as a fan of Satan's Son from Defenders, and it shat all over him and those stories. I also wasn't that attuned to creators or credits, so the upheaval of the series wasn't something I was aware of. I just read through all 21 issues and hated it. The history and the behind the scenes stuff with this series is something that I have come to understand a lot more finally out of trying to come to grips with what they did to Satan's Son. Issue 9 though, I read that a few years ago, and I was pleasantly surprised that it wasn't hot trash. It might be that it is next to shit and poop, so it looks better, but I felt some sense of pleasure in reading a comic I expected to be the worst, and it being alright, and actually doing some of the best stuff of the series. Then there was Creeper #1, which was also by Len Kaminski, and that has a beautiful cover and some great art with absolutely perfect colours. And that issue is about 90% of an enjoyable experience. I don't like the end and twist, but the art, with inks by John Buscema, brother of Sal Buscema, the art is carrying it a lot, but the script and some of the ideas are decent enough. The final straw for me came when I got out Avengers 353 for a covers video. It is part of a short story arc called Fear the Reaper, a story arc that is a guilty pleasure of mine. It's nothing exceptional, but it has its fun and its charm. For years now, I have been under the impression that it was written by and Master Erdlin, who wrote all the other fill-in stories during Bob Patrick Harris's run on Avengers. But that one was actually written by Len Kaminski, and I enjoy it, and I have always enjoyed it. I should have been framing just this page because this one has nothing to do with the bloke who came out of a coma. I'll break the news now. I have read this story in whole. I read it a few months ago. I read it, and that is part of why I am framing this as a Len Kaminski isn't as bad as we thought video. This is a really solid story that understands what to do with Satan's Son better than the previous writer or the future writer. I did some exploring online, and some other people have called this Len Kaminski's best work. So that made me feel less like I was digging through shit and thinking that the toilet paper was gold. Two things need to be said though. First is that Len Kaminski planned this as a much larger story, much longer. We get Act 1, and Act 1 is complete and can just about work on its own. Act 2, however, is one issue. An issue that is credited to Len Kaminski and the same artist. But it doesn't read like Len Kaminski. And a later issue in the letters column corrects the credits to say that it was crediting the wrong person for art. And I believe that is true of the credit for Len Kaminski. That issue too casually and callously breezes through Act 2 in a way to resolve it and say that there's actually no Act 2 or Act 3 and that the story is over. I believe Warren Fallis wrote it, or at least scripted it. Our plot is summarised great on this page. A faith healer, he has been performing miracles. He has been bringing people out of comas, restoring them to life. But he's actually restored them with the souls of the damned, rather than their true souls, which are instead in hell in place of the other souls. We get, and we've just had, a lot of backstory for this one guy, and that is one of the excellent things about this story. It tests us and gets us to sympathise with these bad people who, in this case, have come to accept that they actually deserved to be condemned to hell. This guy was a German soldier. We have a range of different levels of evil. It's not all serial killers and Nazis. There is a sex addict. There's a paedophile. There's a rapist. Actually, the Nazi is one of the more sympathetic ones, come to think of it. One of the last ones we meet is a condemned soul who was a lesbian. And that is her sin. That is her only sin. She was and is a lesbian. She was condemned to hell for being a lesbian. Now, she is in the body of a straight, married woman. And even though we have the conceit that lesbians go to hell, I think the characterisation and the depiction of her is all well-intentioned. I also think it might be why Len Kaminski didn't last on the title. Marvel was still... well, it's the same thing as Scott Loball on Alpha Strike. He was fired for having Northman declare he was gay. And you should see the filth Marvel publish in the letters pages for months afterwards. From what I understand, the big wigs, the corporate stockholder types, they were all raging homophobes and threatened to withdraw investment from Marvel for stuff like that. This is a late 1993. It is a bit late for that kind of thing, but for some reason, Len Kaminski left the title with this story incomplete. Here is the rapist. He is the worst of the bunch, completely evil. Came back in this new body and wastes no time in getting back to raping women. Then lastly, we have this girl. She is the sex addict. She's a bit of a party girl. She takes drugs. And there is a copy of the Daily Planet warning us about the AIDS virus. I still have issues with Len Kaminski. I think both the two things that made me dislike him are still quite big hurdles for him to overcome. But the bigger of the two is being levied a bit by a lot of the blame being elsewhere. He is still a lackey willing to carry out a story like that. And he thinks the team starring Speedy Bowles is too dark. But he wrote the best story in the 90s Satan Son series. And maybe we have all been a bit too quick to write him off because he was so unbelievably unremarkable on other titles. He has good stories in him. This and Fear the Reaper. And maybe there is more out there. And like this, they are unfairly buried between shit and poop. I've got to give this 7 thumbs up.